Imagine walking through the corridors of a detention facility where the sound of your footsteps echoes differently than in ordinary buildings, where the air carries the weight of secrets that governments prefer to keep buried in classified files, where over 10,000 human beings exist in a legal limbo that most of the world has never seen. By September 2025, Israel held 914 Palestinians in custody across a network of facilities that spans from basement interrogation rooms in Jerusalem to desert camps that stretch beyond the horizon. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. 474 of these people have never been convicted of any crime. They exist in something called administrative detention, renewable indefinitely, justified by evidence they can never see, reviewed by courts they can never challenge. This isn't ancient history. This is happening right now, in 2025, documented by Reuters, verified by Israel's own public defender's office, measured in square meters so small that 90% of detainees live in spaces smaller than your bathroom. Today, we're opening the classified files on the world's most sophisticated detention system. We're going to trace its evolution from a single facility in 1968 to an archipelago of 23 named sites, plus unknown numbers in military camps. We're going to examine the architectural blueprints, the administrative procedures, the psychological engineering that transforms human beings into renewable case files. This is forensic history for people who want to understand how systems of power actually operate when nobody's watching. If you're ready to see what happens when emergency becomes permanent, when temporary becomes indefinite, when the exception becomes the rule, then this investigation is for you. The blueprint is about to be revealed. In the year 2025, there exists a map that refuses to be a map. It sprawls across territories and jurisdictions like a ghost archipelago, connecting places that were never meant to touch. This is not the geography of borders or cities. This is the geography of detention, and it begins not with walls, but with doors. Street arrest leads to transfer van. Transfer van leads to intake cage. Intake cage leads to interrogation site. Interrogation site leads to desert compound. Desert compound leads to military court. Each handoff calculated, each movement tracked, each body becoming a file that moves through a system designed never to rest. The infrastructure operates on a simple principle. You don't build one fortress. You build handoffs, doors that open and close in sequence, paperwork that follows predetermined paths, identity cards that unlock certain corridors while sealing others, transport routes that carve invisible highways through ordinary landscapes, jurisdictions that keep responsibility moving, always moving, so that no single institution bears the full weight of what happens inside. By October 2025, Reuters counted over 9,100 Palestinians held across 23 named prisons and detention centers. But the count carried its own confession. Unknown numbers held in military-run camps like Sede Taiman and Naphtali meant even the official ledger admitted its own blind spots. The system had grown so large it could no longer see itself entirely. The numbers tell us about scale. They do not tell us about architecture. They do not tell us why some people describe this network as being hidden in plain sight. To understand that, you have to descend into the places where the system touches the city, where ordinary life continues above while something else happens below. Jerusalem in autumn smells like stone dust and coffee. Tourists navigate narrow streets with maps folded wrong, pointing cameras at walls that have witnessed empires rise and fall. But some walls in Jerusalem conceal rooms that no guidebook mentions. Some basements house activities that transform the meaning of the word neighborhood. The Russian compound sits in West Jerusalem like a bureaucratic fortress disguised as civic architecture. Inside its perimeter, the Moscovia Detention Center operates as an interrogation facility, its reputation spreading through human rights reports like ink through water. The facility specializes in a particular kind of urban camouflage, a detention node embedded in a city center, near ordinary life, where soundproofing and locked corridors do the work that walls usually do. Rights groups describe it as a major interrogation site for Palestinian detainees, including minors. Activists who have tracked its operations for decades speak of dungeon-like cells carved into the building's foundation, spaces where natural light becomes a memory and time stretches into shapes the human mind was never designed to hold. The facility's notoriety grows from what happens inside its subterranean maze: harsh methods applied systematically, procedures refined through repetition, interrogation techniques that blur the line between questioning and breaking. Urban camouflage works because it hides in plain sight. No barbed wire announces the building's purpose. No guard towers mark its perimeter. Just doors that lock from the outside and corridors that lead deeper underground, where the city's ordinary sounds fade into silence and something else begins. But the city basement represents only the front end of a much larger machine. When volume overwhelms urban space, when the holding cells fill beyond capacity, when the system needs to process numbers that cannot be absorbed by ordinary infrastructure, the bodies move outward, away from the city's complicated politics, and toward places where different rules apply. The calendar reads December 1968. The landscape stretches flat and brown under a winter sky that promises nothing. Here, on a former Jordanian base location, the Israeli military establishes Camp Ofer, a facility that will grow and evolve with the changing demands of occupation. What begins as a military outpost will transform into a prison complex as mass detention needs rise beyond the capacity of existing infrastructure. The engineering principles are simple: process over place. Holding capacity targets replace architectural aesthetics. Administrative categories multiply to accommodate the complexity of legal limbo. The site's location provides access to military logistics in the West Bank, while maintaining distance from the political complications of urban centers. This is detention as industrial design, optimized for throughput rather than rehabilitation. Ofer's history reveals the system's most important feature: flexibility. Facilities can close and reopen depending on political temperature. Detention becomes a dial, not an exception. Turn it down during periods of negotiation and international scrutiny. Turn it up when crisis demands rapid expansion. The infrastructure remains constant while the official story shifts with the political weather. But even the most carefully calibrated dial can be overwhelmed by events that exceed its design parameters. When the first Intifada erupts in 1987, the dial gets cranked so hard the system has to invent new categories of space, new definitions of temporary, new ways to warehouse human beings at desert scale. March 1988. The first Intifada surges beyond every projection, every contingency plan, every assumption about how many bodies a detention system might need to absorb. The urban centers fill first, then the West Bank facilities reach capacity. Emergency requires a brutal architectural answer. Qaziot, known to its inmates as Ansar III, opens as a desert detention camp designed to swallow thousands. The desert offers advantages that cities cannot provide. Isolation measured not in city blocks, but in kilometers of empty land stretching to horizons that mock any notion of escape. Distance from courts, from lawyers, from families, from journalists asking uncomfortable questions. But isolation alone does not explain why planners choose this particular emptiness for their expansion. Climate becomes control. Heat that bakes initiative out of bodies accustomed to Mediterranean temperatures. Dust that infiltrates every breath, every pore, every attempt to maintain dignity. The psychological message transmitted by the landscape itself: you have been warehoused far from civilization, in a place where your presence or absence changes nothing about the world's daily operation. Human Rights Watch documented the detention camp network becoming what they called a full-fledged detention system early in the Intifada, with thousands held in conditions that blurred the line between emergency and permanence. The language of temporariness masked the reality of indefinite expansion. What was meant to be a quick fix became the operating system. A tent city rises faster than any prison, cheaper than any courthouse, more flexible than any permanent structure. Canvas and stakes, guard towers and razor wire, administrative trailers and interrogation sheds arranged in patterns that maximize control while minimizing cost. But what happens when temporary becomes the default setting for an entire population's relationship to justice? The camp's internal mathematics tell a story about how human beings become units in a daily ledger. Sections divided by function. Counts taken at prescribed intervals. Partitions designed to eliminate privacy while maintaining visibility for guards. The rhythm of confinement calibrated to break individual will while maintaining aggregate order. Human Rights Watch described the engineering in forensic detail. Tent sizes standardized for efficient monitoring. Head counts per tent calculated to maximize discomfort while avoiding obvious brutality. Visibility blocked between sections by sand and gravel ridges that serve dual purposes. Preventing coordination between inmates while providing defensive positions for guards during disturbances. Privacy eliminated by design, replaced by surveillance architecture disguised as necessity. The camp's capacity to hold thousands represented more than a quantitative expansion of detention. Scale changed the ethics entirely. Detention stopped being individual punishment and became industrial processing. Each tent housed not criminals but categories: administrative detainees, security prisoners, minors, suspects awaiting trial, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the roundups began. But even the most efficient warehouse requires a factory to feed it. The real power lies not in the holding, but in the deciding. Who enters the system, who stays, and for how long. The desert camp may be the warehouse, but the legal machine operates as the factory that determines human inventory. Administrative detention represents the system's signature innovation: confinement without public trial, renewable over time, justified by classified evidence that neither the detainee nor their lawyer can examine. The procedure optimizes speed and secrecy. Powerful tools in genuine emergencies, corrosive acids when applied as routine policy. The logic appears simple. National security sometimes requires holding people who cannot be prosecuted through ordinary courts, either because the evidence against them remains classified or because they represent threats that traditional legal categories cannot capture. Emergency powers for emergency times. Temporary measures for temporary crises. But emergency has a way of becoming permanent when it offers solutions to permanent problems. Administrative detention provides a legal framework for holding people indefinitely while maintaining the appearance of lawful process. Renewable orders that create the illusion of regular review while ensuring that the renewal itself becomes routine. Time without trial that stretches beyond any reasonable definition of temporary. By September 2025, B'Tselem counted 3,474 Palestinians in administrative detention. Not convicted prisoners serving sentences for specific crimes. Not suspects awaiting trial for particular charges. Administrative detainees living inside renewable uncertainty. Their release dates determined not by courts, but by security assessments conducted in secret by institutions accountable to no public process. The statistics capture the scale but not the texture of this legal limbo. They count bodies but not the smell of corridors where hope goes to die slowly. They measure duration but not the psychological architecture of indefinite time. To understand how the system operates on human skin, you have to step inside the daily protocols where law meets flesh, where procedure becomes experience, where the neat categories of national security translate into the messy reality of human captivity. The intake sequence begins before arrival. Transport vehicles designed more for cargo than passengers, shackles that prioritize security over circulation, windows blocked or tinted to prevent landmarks from marking the journey's destination. By the time the doors open at the facility's receiving area, disorientation has already begun its work. Strip, search, tag, photograph, number. Identity becomes metadata processed through administrative systems that transform names into case files, histories into risk assessments, futures into security classifications. The human being who entered the transport vehicle emerges from intake as a file that will move through the system according to protocols designed for efficiency rather than justice. The logistics of volume reveal themselves in the bottlenecks: transport schedules that coordinate multiple facilities, holding pens that manage overflow when intake capacity exceeds staffing, administrative delays that create human traffic jams in corridors designed for smooth processing. the quiet power of the clipboard that determines which line leads to interrogation, which to general population, which to indefinite isolation. Reuters documented multiple detention categories operating simultaneously by 2025. Administrative detainees held without trial, convicted prisoners serving sentences, minors processed through separate facilities, women held under different protocols, Gaza detainees held under the unlawful combatants law rather than ordinary criminal procedure. Each category follows distinct legal pathways while sharing the same physical infrastructure, creating a complex system where location matters less than classification. But classification itself becomes a form of control. The file determines everything: which facility, which cell, which privileges, which restrictions, which legal representation, which family visits, which medical care, which hope for eventual release. The file moves through the system while the body follows, passive cargo in a logistical network, optimized for containment rather than resolution. When the file reaches interrogation, architecture becomes psychology. Back inside the Russian compound's Moscovia facility, the built environment transforms into a precision instrument designed for persuasion. Cells carved from stone and concrete, corridors that lead nowhere and everywhere, lighting controlled to disorient circadian rhythms, sound managed to amplify isolation while maintaining the constant awareness of institutional presence. The interrogation rooms themselves tell their own story through forensic details preserved in human rights documentation. Dimensions calculated to create specific psychological effects, too small for comfort, too large for intimacy, sized precisely to generate the correct ratio of vulnerability to authority. Furniture bolted to floors that cannot be moved, rearranged, or used as weapons. Tables positioned to force detainees to sit with their backs to doors, ensuring that every entrance and exit occurs outside their field of vision. Temperature control operates as another variable in the equation of persuasion, too hot during summer interrogations that stretch beyond endurance, too cold during winter sessions that make concentration impossible. The climate inside these rooms follows no schedule except the one designed to break down resistance through the accumulated stress of physical discomfort layered beneath psychological pressure. Hidden in plain sight becomes the facility's signature achievement. Moscovia sits embedded in Jerusalem's urban infrastructure like a tumor disguised as healthy tissue. No external signs announce its function. No architectural features distinguish it from the city's other institutional buildings. Just doors that lock from the outside and windows that face inward, toward courtyards designed for containment rather than illumination. The system's invisibility serves a dual purpose. It prevents public awareness of what happens inside while maintaining the fiction that these activities exist outside normal civic life. Torture hidden in basement rooms operates differently from torture conducted in remote camps. Urban torture requires soundproofing and bureaucratic camouflage. It demands the kind of institutional discipline that can inflict systematic cruelty while maintaining the appearance of lawful procedure. Amnesty International and other watchdog organizations have documented patterns stretching across decades: blindfolding and handcuffing during arrest and transport, prolonged stress positions that damage circulation and joints, incommunicado periods that prevent legal representation during the most vulnerable phases of detention, sleep deprivation applied systematically to break down cognitive resistance, sexual humiliation used as a tool of psychological degradation. The allegations accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer, building a geological record of institutional behavior that exceeds individual sadism and approaches systematic methodology. This is not the random cruelty of individual guards. This is interrogation as industrial process, refined through decades of application and designed to extract information while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods employed. But interrogation represents only one stage in a longer process. The real power operates where stories are prevented rather than extracted, in courtrooms that function as conveyor belts rather than forums for justice, where the speed of processing matters more than the quality of deliberation. The military court ecosystem functions as an institutional hinge between arrest and long-term detention, a bureaucratic machine that transforms suspicion into legal fact through procedures optimized for efficiency rather than accuracy. These are not courtrooms in any traditional sense. They are processing centers where justice becomes an administrative function performed by people trained to handle volume rather than complexity. Forensic examination of the system reveals its priorities through simple measurement: docket volume that would overwhelm civilian courts operating under normal constitutional protections, translation friction that prevents meaningful communication between detainees and the legal apparatus designed to judge them, classified material presented as evidence but never subjected to adversarial testing, hearings measured in minutes rather than hours, designed to process cases rather than resolve them. The International Committee of the Red Cross reported that, since the beginning of the occupation, more than 200,000 cases have been handled in military courts. The number tells a story about scale as a defining feature of the system. 200,000 individual human stories processed through institutional machinery, designed for throughput rather than truth. Scale changes everything about justice. When courts handle dozens of cases, each receives individual attention. When they handle hundreds, procedures become routinized. When they handle thousands, justice becomes an assembly line where speed trumps accuracy and volume overwhelms the human capacity for careful judgment. 200,000 cases represent not just quantitative expansion, but qualitative transformation of what courts are designed to accomplish. The military court system operates according to different rules than civilian justice, rules designed for occupied territories where normal constitutional protections do not apply, evidence standards lowered to accommodate security needs, due process abbreviated to match military efficiency, appeal processes streamlined to prevent indefinite delay of security decisions. Each modification justified by emergency logic that has now persisted for decades. But even streamlined courts require legal mechanisms to handle cases that exceed their processing capacity, cases where evidence remains too classified for trial, or where detention serves purposes beyond criminal punishment. For these situations, the system deploys its most potent tool: administrative detention that operates entirely outside the court system while maintaining the appearance of legal oversight. Administrative detention renewal operates like a clock that resets itself, a bureaucratic perpetual motion machine that generates its own justification for continued operation. Orders extended by military commanders who review classified intelligence unavailable to detainees or their lawyers. Dates shifted according to security assessments that cannot be challenged because they cannot be examined. The end always moved one corridor further away, one hearing deeper into an indefinite future. The psychological engineering operates with surgical precision. Indefinite time creates compliance pressure more effectively than harsh conditions or physical abuse. Uncertainty becomes a containment protocol that generates cooperation through hope rather than fear. The promise of eventual release maintains behavioral control while the indefinite timeline prevents planning for life beyond detention. Administrative detainees live inside renewable uncertainty. Every few months they appear before review panels that rubber-stamp continued detention based on classified evidence. The hearings create the illusion of legal process, while the predetermined outcomes reveal their true function: bureaucratic theater designed to legitimize indefinite containment. By September 2025, the count reaches 3,474 Palestinians in administrative detention. Not people awaiting trial for specific crimes. Not convicts serving sentences for particular violations. Administrative detainees whose continued imprisonment depends entirely on secret evidence reviewed by security officials accountable to no public process. The number represents more than statistical data. It represents 3,474 individual human beings living inside legal limbo, their futures determined by bureaucrats operating according to classified criteria they will never understand. 3,474 people whose families wake up each morning unsure whether today will bring release or another renewal of indefinite captivity. But even indefinite detention sometimes meets resistance that cannot be contained through legal procedures or psychological pressure. Sometimes the resistance weaponizes the only thing that remains under the control of the captive: the decision to eat or refuse food, to live or slowly die in full view of the institutional machinery designed to break human will. The year 2012 witnessed mass hunger strikes that transformed detention from invisible administrative process into public crisis requiring diplomatic intervention. Palestinian detainees across multiple facilities coordinated their refusal to eat, creating a slow-motion emergency that forced policy decisions into international headlines. Bodies became weapons in a war where the battlefield was public opinion and the ammunition was the willingness to die for political change. Hunger strikes operate according to their own strategic logic. Individual resistance can be ignored or suppressed. Collective resistance that threatens mass death cannot be dismissed without consequences that extend beyond prison walls. International attention forces transparency. Medical monitoring creates accountability. Reputational damage generates pressure for political solutions to administrative problems. Negotiation logistics reveal themselves in the mechanics of crisis management. Mediators acceptable to both sides. Prison administrators suddenly accountable for medical outcomes. International observers demanding access to facilities normally closed to outside scrutiny. Detention becomes a public relations battlefield where institutional secrecy collides with humanitarian emergency broadcast live to global audiences. A UK government statement from 2012 welcomed an agreement that included commitments to limit administrative detention and solitary confinement while reinstating family visits suspended during the strike. The language of international diplomacy acknowledged what hunger strikers had demonstrated. Even the most carefully designed detention system remains vulnerable to resistance that transforms individual suffering into collective political action. The agreement represented victory for the hunger strikers, but also revealed the system's fundamental flexibility. Concessions that appeared significant in crisis could be quietly reversed when international attention moved elsewhere. Administrative detention limits could be reimposed when emergencies provided new justification. Family visits could be suspended again when security assessments determined that privilege threatened institutional control. Ink on paper is the system's native language, but paper serves institutional power rather than individual rights. What happens when the bureaucratic promises contained in negotiated settlements collide with events that exceed their parameters, when new crises overwhelm old agreements, when the desert camps closed by diplomatic pressure are forced to reopen by strategic necessity? The year 2013 arrives with diplomatic optimism and bureaucratic promises. Agreements signed during hunger strike negotiations create the illusion of systematic reform. International observers speak of progress and improved conditions. Human rights organizations document modest improvements in family visit policies and limitations on solitary confinement. For a brief moment, it appears that pressure and negotiation can modify the system's harshest edges. But the system's most important characteristic is not its capacity for reform, it is its capacity for expansion when crisis demands it. The diplomatic agreements that appeared to constrain administrative detention and improve conditions operate only as long as political circumstances allow them to operate. When new emergencies arise, when security assessments change, when political calculations shift, the restraints dissolve like sugar in water. The machinery of detention proves more durable than the paper agreements designed to limit it. Facilities can be reopened as quickly as they were closed. Administrative categories can be expanded as easily as they were contracted. Legal restrictions can be suspended as readily as they were implemented. The system's flexibility serves institutional power rather than human rights, providing the appearance of constraint while maintaining the capability for unlimited expansion. By 2015, the same desert that witnessed hunger strike negotiations begins to fill again with new populations processed through expanded administrative procedures. Qtsiot reopens not with fanfare or international attention, but quietly, efficiently, as part of routine administrative adjustments to changing security needs. The diplomatic promises of 2012 become historical footnotes to the enduring logic of indefinite detention. The desert camp's resurrection demonstrates the system's essential truth. Temporary closure does not mean permanent dismantlement. Infrastructure designed for mass detention remains permanently available for reactivation when political circumstances require it. The tents may be folded and stored, but the electrical systems remain connected. The guard towers may be unmanned, but their foundations remain solid. The administrative buildings may be emptied, but their filing systems remain intact, ready to process new populations according to familiar procedures. Katsiot's reopening operates according to the same engineering principles that governed its original construction: desert isolation that maximizes control while minimizing public visibility, administrative efficiency that prioritizes volume processing over individual justice, legal flexibility that allows indefinite expansion without constitutional constraints. The physical infrastructure may appear identical to its earlier incarnation, but the political context has evolved to accommodate even larger populations held for even longer periods under even more restrictive conditions. The camp's expansion capacity exceeds its original design parameters. New tent sections spread across desert land that seemed infinite during the facility's first incarnation. Administrative trailers multiply to accommodate expanded bureaucratic requirements. Guard positions increased to maintain security ratios calibrated for larger populations. What began as emergency expansion becomes permanent infrastructure, designed to absorb whatever numbers the system generates. But even the most carefully engineered detention facility remains vulnerable to human ingenuity applied with desperate patience over years of confinement. Even maximum security prisons can be compromised by people who have nothing but time and the unbreakable motivation that comes from having nothing left to lose. September 2021. Gilboa Prison, a maximum security facility designed to contain the most dangerous security prisoners, becomes the stage for an escape that transforms 6 Palestinian inmates into international headlines. The operation began in a bathroom, progressed through months of careful excavation, and culminated in a tunnel that breached the prison's perimeter during the early hours of a Monday morning, when guard rotations created a brief window of reduced surveillance. The tunnel itself tells a story about human determination applied to seemingly impossible circumstances. Hand tools improvised from materials available within the prison commissary. Excavation conducted in shifts carefully coordinated to avoid detection during routine cell inspections. Soil disposal managed to prevent accumulation that would signal unauthorized construction activity. Engineering calculations performed without blueprints or technical training, relying entirely on intuitive understanding of structural stress and soil composition. The escape's immediate impact extended far beyond the 6 individuals who disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Security protocols throughout the entire prison system required immediate review and modification. Administrative procedures that had operated routinely for decades suddenly demanded emergency revision. The illusion of total institutional control shattered against the reality that human ingenuity, applied with sufficient patience and motivation, could overcome even the most sophisticated security systems. But the tunnel's deeper significance lay in its revelation that maximum security detention, despite its technological sophistication and administrative precision, remained fundamentally vulnerable to the one variable that no system could fully control: the human capacity for hope expressed through methodical resistance. The 6 escapees had demonstrated that even the most carefully designed prison could be hollowed out from within by people who refused to accept the permanence of their confinement. The escape investigation revealed systemic vulnerabilities that extended beyond the specific bathroom where excavation began. Guard rotation schedules that created predictable gaps in surveillance coverage, administrative routines that prioritized efficiency over comprehensive security monitoring, architectural features that provided concealment opportunities for long-term projects conducted by inmates with unlimited time and unshakable motivation. Prison administrators responded with expanded security measures designed to prevent similar breaches, enhanced surveillance technology, modified guard schedules, architectural modifications to eliminate concealment opportunities, administrative procedures designed to detect unauthorized construction activity before it could compromise perimeter security. But each countermeasure revealed the system's fundamental paradox. The more secure it becomes, the more it resembles the totalitarian nightmare it claims to prevent. The Gilboa escape demonstrated that even maximum security prisons remained vulnerable to human determination, but the lesson extended beyond individual facilities to the entire detention system. If a maximum security prison designed for the most dangerous inmates could be compromised by improvised tools and patient excavation, what would happen when an entire war suddenly dumped thousands of new detainees into a system already operating beyond its intended capacity? October 7, 2023. The date arrives like a historical fault line that splits time into before and after. Hamas launches an unprecedented attack that kills over 1,000 Israelis and captures hundreds more as hostages. The Israeli response generates a war that will reshape the geography of Gaza and transform the mathematics of detention from administrative challenge into humanitarian crisis. The surge begins immediately. Mass arrests across the West Bank as security forces implement pre-planned detention sweeps designed to prevent secondary attacks. Gaza detainees captured during military operations and transported to facilities never designed for such volume. Emergency classifications that bypass normal legal procedures to accommodate rapid processing of unprecedented numbers. The detention system experiences expansion shock that tests every assumption about capacity, procedure, and human limits. Emergency logistics reveal themselves in the bureaucratic scramble to accommodate volume that overwhelms existing infrastructure. Where do you house people when prisons designed for thousands suddenly need to hold tens of thousands? You build detention the way militaries build field hospitals, fast, modular, and brutal. Temporary becomes the new permanent, as emergency measures expand beyond their intended scope and duration. Military-run camps like Detention and Naftali emerge from the administrative shadows to accommodate overflow that civilian prisons cannot absorb. These facilities operate under different rules than conventional detention centers, rules designed for military emergencies rather than civilian justice. Less oversight, fewer legal protections, greater secrecy, and administrative procedures optimized for security rather than human rights. Reuters reports additional unknown numbers held in these military facilities separate from the official prison counts that track civilian detention. The language of unknown numbers represents more than statistical uncertainty. It represents the system's confession that emergency expansion has created blind zones where traditional accountability mechanisms cannot penetrate. The opacity operates as a feature rather than a bug. Emergency conditions justify reduced transparency, while expanded detention populations create logistical challenges that overwhelm normal oversight mechanisms. International observers struggle to monitor facilities they cannot access. Human rights organizations document allegations they cannot verify. Families search for relatives whose locations remain classified according to security protocols designed for military operations rather than civilian detention. The new sites are framed as temporary responses to extraordinary circumstances, emergency measures that will be phased out once normal conditions return. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when it solves problems that persist beyond the emergency that created them. Military camps designed for short-term holding evolve into long-term facilities when the underlying conflict continues without resolution. The temporary classification provides political cover for conditions that would be unacceptable in permanent facilities. Emergency justifies reduced space standards, limited medical care, restricted legal access, suspended family visits, and administrative procedures that prioritize security over human dignity. What begins as crisis response becomes operational norm when crisis itself becomes the permanent condition. Until a doctor's letter turns the lights on and forces the public to see what has been happening in the shadows of military secrecy and emergency classification. Detention emerges from bureaucratic obscurity into international headlines as whistleblower accounts and leaked medical reports document conditions that transform detention into systematic dehumanization. The facility operates as a military-run detention camp for Gaza detainees. a place where emergency logistics meet human bodies under conditions designed more for warehousing than custody. The engineering of restraint reveals itself in forensic detail preserved in whistleblower testimony and medical documentation. Constant shackling that prevents normal movement, sleep, or basic human functions. Blindfolding applied as standard procedure rather than specific security measure. Medical understaffing that treats human health as secondary to administrative efficiency. An institutional logic that reduces human beings to numbers processed through systems designed for inventory management rather than criminal justice. The camp operates according to principles that prioritize throughput over rehabilitation, containment over justice, administrative efficiency over human dignity. Detainees become units in a logistical equation where the goal is not punishment or correction but simple warehousing of bodies that cannot be released but cannot be formally processed through normal legal procedures. Medical whistleblowers describe conditions that blur the line between detention and torture. Inadequate food that causes rapid weight loss, overcrowding that prevents basic hygiene, medical neglect that allows treatable conditions to become life-threatening complications. These are not the random failures of understaffed institutions, but systematic policies designed to reduce human beings to their most basic biological functions. The constant restraints serve purposes beyond security. Shackling for weeks or months causes physical damage that extends beyond the period of restraint itself. Circulation problems, joint damage, muscle atrophy, and psychological trauma that persists long after the shackles are removed. The body becomes the site where administrative policy inflicts permanent damage, disguised as temporary security measures. Reuters reports that Israel said it was phasing out use of the military detention camp amid abuse allegations by June 2024, a statement that implies official recognition of a reputational crisis requiring immediate damage control. The announcement frames closure as voluntary policy adjustment rather than response to international pressure, maintaining the fiction that the system operates according to its own internal standards rather than external oversight. But phasing out operates according to bureaucratic logic that prioritizes appearance over substance. The language suggests gradual reduction rather than immediate cessation, creating temporal space for continued operations under modified procedures. More importantly, it does not address the fundamental question: where do the bodies go when one facility closes but the underlying detention needs persist? Phase out doesn't mean stop. It can mean move. And moving a problem can spread it across a wider geographic and administrative area while dispersing responsibility among multiple institutions that can each claim partial rather than total accountability for the overall system's operations. Under legal pressure to improve conditions at Detention, detainees are transferred to other facilities throughout the detention network, carrying with them the same classification categories and administrative procedures that created the original crisis. The transfer process reveals the system's essential character. Problems migrate more easily than solutions, and institutional reform often means institutional displacement rather than institutional change. The protocols that created abusive conditions at Detention do not disappear when detainees are moved to new facilities. Same restraint procedures, same medical neglect, same denial of basic human dignity, different fences and different administrative letterheads. The building was never the source of the cruelty. The policies were. And policies travel light while buildings remain anchored to specific coordinates. Associated Press reports detainees and rights groups alleging that abuse relocated to West Bank sites after international scrutiny forced modifications at Detention. The military denies systematic mistreatment while acknowledging occasional overcrowding, a response that frames systematic policy as isolated incident while treating structural problems as resource management challenges. The denial patterns reveal institutional behavior designed to compartmentalize responsibility while maintaining operational continuity. Individual facilities become scapegoats for system-wide policies that exceed any single location's decision-making authority. Administrative decentralization provides plausible deniability while ensuring that the underlying logic of mass detention continues regardless of specific facility closures or personnel changes. The investigation begins to fracture the institutional consensus that had protected the system from public scrutiny. When investigators arrive to question soldiers about suspected abuse, the response reveals deeper tensions within the system itself about accountability, oversight, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior during emergency operations. July 29, 2024. Reuters documents protests and break-ins at military compounds after investigators arrived to question soldiers over suspected abuse connected to detention operations. The invisible chorus that had maintained operational secrecy suddenly fractures into competing factions. Soldiers defending their actions, commanders protecting institutional reputation, politicians managing public relations crisis, protesters demanding accountability for behavior they consider either criminal or heroic, depending on their political perspective. The break-ins represent more than support for individual soldiers facing investigation. They represent a political movement defending the principle that military personnel should not face civilian oversight for actions taken during military operations, regardless of whether those actions comply with international law or domestic regulations. The protests transformed detention policy into domestic political crisis, forcing questions about military accountability that extend far beyond specific facilities or particular cases. The story transforms from what happened to detainees to who controls the narrative of what happened, revealing that the real power struggle centers not on conditions inside detention facilities, but on institutional authority to define acceptable behavior during emergency operations. The investigation process becomes the site where competing political visions clash over fundamental questions about military power, civilian oversight, and democratic accountability. The facility break-ins demonstrate that the detention system exists within broader political networks that can mobilize physical resistance when the system faces external accountability measures. The protests reveal constituencies that view detention operations as legitimate state power rather than potential criminal activity, constituencies willing to use force to prevent investigation of activities they consider essential to national security. But the state attempts to restore institutional order through reassertions of command authority and legal process, even as the underlying mathematics continue to generate new crises faster than administrative adjustments can accommodate them. More detainees, more deaths in custody, more legal complications, more international pressure, more domestic political instability. The system begins to overheat under pressures that exceed its design parameters, generating breakdown symptoms that manifest in the most basic metrics of institutional failure. Human death inside facilities designed for human containment. The post-2023 escalation creates a forensic timeline of systematic collapse measured in the most final of administrative categories. Deaths in custody that transform detention statistics from bureaucratic data into humanitarian catastrophe. Each death represents individual tragedy, but the aggregate pattern reveals institutional breakdown operating at scale and speed that overwhelms normal oversight mechanisms. Resource collapse manifests in medical emergency after medical emergency. Overcrowding that prevents basic sanitation, hygiene breakdowns that create disease vectors, skin disease outbreaks that signal systematic neglect of human health, food scarcity that causes malnutrition in facilities designed for temporary holding. Maintenance failure becomes humanitarian failure when administrative efficiency prioritizes security over survival. The deaths occurred not through deliberate killing, but through systematic indifference applied at industrial scale. Medical neglect that treats human health as administrative inconvenience. Overcrowding that creates disease conditions easily prevented through basic resource allocation. Food restriction that weakens immune systems already compromised by stress and unsanitary conditions. Administrative inefficiency that prevents timely medical intervention for easily treatable conditions. Reuters cites rights groups reporting 77 Palestinian detainees died in Israeli custody since the war began, a number that represents more than statistical data. 77 individual human beings who entered detention alive and emerged dead, each death requiring its own administrative explanation, each family demanding answers that the system cannot provide without admitting systematic failure. The number grows not through spectacular violence but through accumulated negligence applied routinely across multiple facilities operating under emergency conditions that have become permanent operating procedures. Each death individually explained as medical emergency, administrative oversight, resource shortage, or security necessity. Collectively, they reveal institutional homicide disguised as bureaucratic failure. Once deaths become a statistic rather than an exception, the fundamental question becomes unavoidable. What does the system look like when it's audited by its own institutions rather than external critics? What happens when the state's own legal apparatus examines detention operations according to official standards rather than security classifications? What emerges when institutional self-examination replaces external accountability as the mechanism for transparency? The answer reveals that even the most carefully constructed system of secrecy cannot entirely prevent its own institutions from documenting the reality of their operations when that reality becomes impossible to ignore or deny. A 2025 audit by Israel's Public Defender's Office cuts through decades of administrative language and security classifications to document what detention looks like when measured against the state's own legal standards rather than external criticism. The Wall Street Journal reports findings that read like a medical examiner's report on institutional death. Severe conditions for Palestinian prisoners after October 7th that include starvation, beatings, overcrowding, and scabies spreading through facilities designed for human habitation. The audit operates as a rare mirror held up to the system by its own institutional apparatus, not human rights organizations with political agendas, not international observers with diplomatic objectives. The state's own legal representatives examining detention operations according to official standards and finding systematic failure that cannot be explained away through emergency classification or security necessity. Forensic detail transforms horror into measurable reality. Cell space measurements that reveal human beings warehoused in areas smaller than animal cages. Floor sleeping that treats mattresses as luxury rather than basic necessity. Water access restricted to levels that threaten human health. Hygiene rules suspended in favor of administrative efficiency. Detention becomes a measurable collapse of civilization disguised as legal procedure. The Wall Street Journal reports lawyers found 90% of Palestinian detainees in visited sites lived in spaces below 3 square meters. 3 square meters represents an area smaller than most prison cells, smaller than most bathrooms, smaller than most closets in ordinary homes. 90% of detainees warehoused in spaces that would be considered inhumane for laboratory animals, let alone human beings awaiting legal process. Extreme weight loss documented through medical examination reveals systematic starvation disguised as administrative efficiency. Bodies that enter detention at normal weights emerge months later showing signs of malnutrition that indicate sustained food restriction applied as policy rather than resource shortage. The human form becomes evidence of institutional cruelty measured in lost pounds and visible ribs. Routine violence allegations documented through medical evidence that cannot be dismissed as propaganda or political exaggeration. Bruises that follow patterns indicating systematic beating rather than random assault. Injuries that require medical intervention for damage inflicted inside facilities designed for custody rather than punishment. Bodies bearing witness to institutional behavior that exceeds legal authority while maintaining administrative legitimacy. The audit documents not individual failures but systematic policies that transform detention into slow-motion execution through accumulated neglect and deliberate cruelty. These are not the random mistakes of overwhelmed institutions, but careful administrative decisions designed to maximize human suffering while maintaining legal plausibility and bureaucratic deniability. But audits document systems without ending them. Investigation reveals reality without changing it. Documentation creates historical record without ensuring institutional reform. The most comprehensive audit in the system's history produces the most detailed evidence of systematic abuse, while the underlying machinery continues to operate according to the same principles that created the documented horrors. The 2025 ledger reads like a noir confession written in numbers that refuse to lie. End of September 2025. 10,914 Palestinians in custody according to B'Tselem's comprehensive count. Not convicted criminals serving sentences for specific crimes. Not suspects awaiting trial for particular charges. Human beings held inside a legal apparatus designed to maintain indefinite captivity through administrative procedure. The total includes 3,474 Palestinians in administrative detention, a number that represents the system's signature achievement. Legal tool that can scale without trials, without public evidence, without temporal limits, without constitutional constraints. Administrative detention as the perfect bureaucratic weapon, capable of indefinite expansion while maintaining the appearance of legal process. Reuters adds additional complexity to the statistical portrait. About 3,544 administrative detainees and 2,673 Gaza detainees held under the Unlawful Combatants Law prior to a release deal negotiated through American diplomatic intervention. Multiple legal pipelines feeding one carceral body, different classifications producing identical outcomes. Indefinite captivity subject to political rather than legal resolution. The mathematics reveal a system operating beyond the capacity of normal legal categories: administrative detention, criminal conviction, military tribunal, unlawful combatant classification, emergency detention, investigative holding. Each category creates separate legal justification for the same practical outcome. Human beings warehoused indefinitely inside institutions designed for temporary custody. The audience now possesses both the blueprint and the ledger. The architectural drawings that show how detention spreads across geographic and legal space. The financial accounting that reveals the human cost measured in bodies rather than currency. The organizational chart that maps how responsibility disperses across multiple institutions, while accountability disappears into bureaucratic gaps between overlapping jurisdictions. But the system's most important room is not a cell. It is not an interrogation chamber. It is not a courtroom or an administrative office. The system's most important space is the gap itself, the unknown numbers category that admits the system's inability to count its own operations. The missing persons space where bureaucratic precision meets its own limitations. The focus shifts to the category that cannot be neatly graphed or efficiently tabulated. Unknown numbers in military-run camps during wartime conditions that prevent normal oversight mechanisms from operating. Limited access that blocks external verification. Families searching for names that appear on no official roster. Detention that operates beyond the reach of normal accountability systems while remaining technically legal under emergency classifications. Infrastructure of disappearance operates through procedural mechanisms rather than dramatic concealment. Restricted visitation policies that prevent family contact without officially prohibiting it. Delayed legal access that complies with formal requirements while ensuring ineffective representation. Transfers without notice that move detainees between facilities according to administrative needs rather than legal requirements. The procedural production of uncertainty serves institutional purposes that extend beyond simple secrecy. Uncertainty prevents families from organizing effective pressure for release. Uncertainty blocks legal representation from developing effective advocacy strategies. Uncertainty transforms detention from visible political issue into invisible administrative process that generates minimal public attention while maximizing institutional flexibility. Reuters explicitly acknowledges additional unknown numbers held in military-run camps, separate from prison counts that track civilian detention. The admission represents official narrative confessing its own blind zones, bureaucratic precision acknowledging its own limitations, institutional transparency revealing the boundaries of its own visibility. Once a system admits blind zones, it breeds mythology about what happens in spaces that official oversight cannot penetrate. The unknown numbers category creates narrative vacuum that fills with speculation, rumor, and fear that may exceed the reality of what actually occurs in the unmonitored spaces. But the vacuum itself becomes a tool of institutional power. generating uncertainty that intimidates potential resistance while protecting actual operations from scrutiny. The mythology serves institutional purposes even when it exceeds institutional reality. Fear of the unknown may deter resistance more effectively than knowledge of actual conditions. Uncertainty about detention policies may generate compliance more efficiently than clarity about actual procedures. The gap in official knowledge becomes a weapon in itself, independent of what actually happens inside the unmonitored facilities. The lost places follow familiar patterns repeated across decades and different political circumstances. City interrogation nodes like Moscovia that embed detention inside urban infrastructure where soundproofing and locked doors provide concealment more effective than geographic isolation. West Bank holding hubs like Ophir that maximize logistical speed between arrest and legal processing while maintaining distance from Israeli civilian populations who might object to detention operations conducted in their neighborhoods. Desert warehousing like Katziot that maximizes land availability and geographic isolation while minimizing operating costs and public visibility. Each location type serves specific functions within the larger system: urban facilities for intensive interrogation, regional hubs for administrative processing, desert camps for mass warehousing of populations that exceed normal facility capacity. Construction logic reveals institutional priorities through architectural choices that prioritize function over form, security over comfort, administrative efficiency over human dignity. Desert camps maximize land and isolation while minimizing construction costs and political complications. Urban centers maximize secrecy and access while providing convenient locations for legal proceedings that require minimal transportation. West Bank sites maximize logistical speed while maintaining legal jurisdiction that avoids constitutional protections available in Israeli civilian courts. Katziot's scale emerges repeatedly in documentation as massive in land area. Hundreds of thousands of square meters designed to accommodate populations that overwhelm normal detention facilities. Major detention hub during Intifada periods when mass arrests exceed urban facility capacity. Infrastructure designed for rapid expansion when political circumstances require immediate absorption of large populations arrested during security sweeps. The machine reveals its shape through accumulated documentation, not a single institution but a network of interconnected facilities that can absorb and redistribute human populations according to political needs, legal classifications, and administrative capacities. A system designed for flexibility rather than justice, expansion rather than rehabilitation, containment rather than resolution. The dangerous question emerges from the accumulated evidence. What is this system actually for? Security that protects civilian populations from legitimate threats? Leverage that generates political concessions through human suffering? Permanence that establishes demographic and territorial control through bureaucratic means rather than military conquest. Detention as leverage reveals itself through prisoner releases tied to political deals that treat human freedom as negotiation currency rather than legal entitlement. Detention populations rise and fall according to diplomatic calculations that have nothing to do with individual guilt or innocence, everything to do with political pressure and strategic advantage. The cold mechanics operate through classification systems that determine which detainees can be traded for which concessions. Administrative categories that seemed bureaucratic abstractions suddenly reveal themselves as political tools designed to maximize negotiating flexibility while maintaining legal cover for what amounts to hostage-taking conducted through judicial procedure. Deportations and conditions attached to releases like contract clauses that transform freedom into conditional privilege rather than restored right. Families become collateral in policy negotiations where individual human stories disappear into aggregate numbers that diplomatic officials trade like commodities in markets where human freedom has become currency. Reuters reports a U.S. brokered deal where Israel released nearly 2,000 Palestinians in exchange for 20 hostages, with subsets deported and others held without court rulings during the war. The mathematics reveal the exchange rate: 2,000 Palestinians for 20 Israelis, a ratio that assigns differential value to human freedom based on nationality, rather than individual circumstances or legal status. The release process exposes detention's true function as political leverage rather than criminal justice. People held for months or years without trial suddenly released en masse when diplomatic pressure requires concessions. Individual cases that seem to require indefinite detention for security reasons suddenly resolved when political calculations change. Administrative necessity that seemed absolute suddenly disappears when strategic advantages shift. If detention operates as policy leverage rather than legal process, then the system's ultimate purpose transcends security, rehabilitation, or punishment. Detention becomes demographic management disguised as criminal justice, territorial control implemented through bureaucratic procedure, political dominance expressed through the power to determine who remains free and who disappears into administrative limbo. The final act cannot be reform, because reform assumes the system's essential legitimacy while proposing modifications to its operation. But legitimacy itself has become the question that the system cannot answer without confessing its own fundamental nature. The philosophical audit reveals that the system can be engineered flawlessly, yet fail morally, politically, and psychologically. The civil engineering metaphor closes the investigation. Every structure has a load it cannot carry forever. Physical buildings collapse when weight exceeds design parameters. Political institutions collapse when legitimacy erodes beyond the point where procedural compliance can substitute for moral authority. Here, the load is legitimacy, and it has been eroded by opacity, indefinite time, and crisis-driven expansion that exceeds any reasonable definition of temporary emergency response. The erosion operates gradually, like water wearing away stone foundations. Each administrative detention renewal chips away credibility. Each death in custody weakens institutional authority. Each blind zone admission undermines claims of lawful procedure. Each transfer without notice reveals arbitrary power disguised as legal necessity. The system maintains operational capacity while losing moral authority, administrative efficiency while sacrificing political legitimacy, bureaucratic precision while generating humanitarian catastrophe. The machinery continues to function while the justifications for its operation collapse under the weight of accumulated evidence that exceeds any reasonable definition of necessary security measures. The most haunting anchor is not a riot or escape or dramatic breakdown. The most haunting anchor is the stable recurrence of numbers that represent routine rather than exception. 3,474 administrative detainees at September 2025's end. A population living inside renewable uncertainty that has become the system's normal operating condition rather than temporary emergency response. The number persists across political changes, diplomatic interventions, international pressure, and domestic criticism. Administrative detention populations rise and fall according to political circumstances, but never disappear entirely, never resolve definitively, never conclude in ways that restore the ordinary relationship between individuals and legal institutions that constitutional democracy requires. 3,474 human beings whose future depends entirely on secret decisions made by security officials accountable to no public process, reviewable through no adversarial procedure, subject to no temporal limitation except administrative convenience and political calculation. 3,474 people living proof that the system has normalized what should be impossible in any society claiming democratic legitimacy. We end on a door closing. Not loud, but routine. Not dramatic, but administrative. Not exceptional, but ordinary. The sound of metal meeting metal as another administrative detention order gets renewed, another indefinite sentence gets extended, another human being disappears into the bureaucratic machinery that has learned to digest individual freedom without producing social indigestion. The real dystopia is not cruelty. Cruelty shocks the conscience and generates resistance. The real dystopia is normalization. When the exceptional becomes routine, when the emergency becomes permanent, when the temporary becomes the operating system for an entire population's relationship to justice. The door closes with the soft click of bureaucratic efficiency. Somewhere in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the desert camps that appear and disappear according to political convenience, another human being begins another indefinite wait for freedom that may never come. The system continues its operations, processing bodies and files with the same mechanical precision that has characterized its evolution from urban basement to desert warehouse to military camp to whatever new form political necessity will require. The machinery hums quietly in the background of ordinary life, invisible to most people, essential to the political order that depends on its continued operation, normalized through decades of gradual expansion that transformed exception into routine, emergency into permanence, temporary detention into indefinite warehousing of human beings whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time under the wrong political circumstances. The blueprint is complete. The system stands revealed. The choice belongs to those who possess the political power to continue its operations or the moral courage to dismantle the machinery that has learned to consume human freedom while maintaining the appearance of legal procedure and bureaucratic legitimacy. The door closes, the system continues. The count begins again tomorrow.